Okay, if we play a word association game with the Council of Nicaea, I think most people think of the Nicene Creed, they think of theology, maybe they think of synodality, but I'm trained as a historian. So when I hear the Council of Nicaea, I think empire. I think the Roman Empire, I think Constantine, I think the beginning of this medieval blending of, to use some fancy words, Christianitas and Romanitas, which is just the fancy way of saying Christianity in Rome. Because Nicaea really is this first meeting place. And, my job as a historian is to keep the theologians honest. That's really that's my only role. And I try to remind them that however important the Nicene Creed is, and it is important, and however important synodality is, and it is important, and however important theology is, and it is important, if we are honest about our own history, we have to remember that the Council of Nicaea simply would not have occurred if it wasn't for the Roman emperor. It could not have occurred. The council, as it was orchestrated, was a gathering of Roman bishops. By Roman bishops, I mean bishops within the Roman Empire. They didn't all speak Latin, they didn't all speak Greek, they weren't just from Italy and modern-day Turkey. They were from all over, but they were Roman. Of the 300 or so bishops who likely attended Nicaea, maybe 2 or 3 of them came from outside of the empire, right? And so when we think about Nicaea and we think about universal, right, and we translate the word ecumenical and we tend to think of universal, I think if we're more honest, a more proper translation would be imperial, right? Because Nicaea was a Roman imperial event. That doesn't mean God can't work through it, right? Because of course we confess that he did. But when we're trying to think about the future of Nicaea or the relevance of Nicaea, we cannot strip it from its historical context, right? And now what's interesting about Nicaea, distinctive from all of the other ecumenical councils, is that Constantine does very much seem to have let the bishops deliberate amongst themselves. His directive to the bishops, as far as we can ascertain, because there are no acts, any knowledge we have of Nicaea comes from decades later by propagandists and so forth. But the best we can tell, Constantine's only directive was, fix the problem. By which he meant, or wanted, unity among the Christians. He was not yet himself even a Christian, but he wanted unity among the Christians. Later emperors, at subsequent councils, almost every single time, had a preordained theological conclusion. They were not actually deliberative events, right? Where the synod of bishops collectively in the space came to their decisions. They knew the verdict they wanted before the gathering even took place, when the invitations went out. Nicaea does seem to be different in that way, right? And maybe that is where the hand of God is. Maybe. But what is absolutely clear is that it was an imperial event. It took imperial orchestration, it took imperial funding, it took imperial force, meaning the losers at Nicaea were expelled from the empire, they were sent into exile, they were stripped of their positions, and the same happened with every subsequent ecumenical council. Does that mean that the theological consensus or the idea of Christ as homoousios with the Father doesn't matter because of these historical conditions? No, of course it matters. But when we're trying to recreate or when we're thinking about the future, we can't have naive, idealistic views that just the Holy Spirit works and it all sorts itself out, that there isn't some context in which it sorts itself out, because that is actually, if we're honest, precisely what happens at Nicaea. The other piece of my contribution here at this conference has to do with the papacy. So one of the things that's really interesting about the development of papal primacy and papal influence in the church is, again, as best as we can ascertain from the reliable records that we have, believe it or not, the Bishop of Rome has absolutely zero role in the Council of Nicaea. The Pope at the time is a man by the name of Sylvester. We don't have anything that survives from Sylvester's pontificate. There are no letters, there are no sermons, there are no inscriptions, there's no writing, there is nothing. In theory, Constantine and Sylvester met. Constantine spent a few years in Rome after he beats Maxentius before he's a Christian, but there is no evidence that they met. Constantine grants the land and provides the funding for the building of the first church at the Vatican, but that, at the time, was outside of the papal domain. The Pope doesn't even have a role in picking the priests who are going to run the church at the Vatican. That's an imperial affair, right? It is, one thing we do know is that the Church of Rome, whether it came from Sylvester or not, we don't know. The Church of Rome sent 2 legates, 2 representatives to Nicaea, 2 priests. We don't really know anything about them. Theoretically, they came back to Rome and reported what happened, but we don't have evidence of that either, right? In later generations, when the Church of Rome would begin to build its own narratives of its institutional significance and importance, they would invent a connection to the Apostle Peter, and they would invent legends of the relationship between Pope Sylvester and Constantine. In one version of this, Constantine has leprosy, and Sylvester miraculously heals him of this leprosy. And then in another tradition, Constantine, as a sort of thank you for this, grants all secular authority over the Western Empire to Sylvester. All of this is a medieval fiction. There is absolutely no reliable historical information for any of this. It is true, as the church grew and adopted imperial structures, even the notion of a geographically based diocese is a Roman appropriation. The Bishop of Rome would, for sure, grow in significance. One of the canons of Nicaea does actually say that the church, I'm paraphrasing, but that the church administratively will be run by the Church of Alexandria for Africa, the Church of Antioch for Asia, and the Church of Rome for Europe. But if we understand the Roman Empire at the time, this is simply a direct mirroring of the way the Roman Empire is itself divided between administrative centers in Alexandria for Africa, in Antioch for Asia, and in Rome for Europe, right? So this, what you see in Nicaea, and this brings me back again to why do I think empire when I hear Council of Nicaea, you see the church to begin to imperialize, to simply conform to existing political structures. And in many ways, this was quite fortuitous. It put an end to the Roman persecutions. It enabled lavish spending on Christianity, which enabled Christianization, the spread of the Christian faith. It enabled the funding of missions beyond the borders, right? The church, in many ways, flourished because of this relationship with the empire. But the church also suffered greatly. Every subsequent ecumenical council after the first was convened because a previous emperor had adopted an imperial policy and made it empire-wide that was deemed to be heretical. So the ecumenical councils were actually called to respond to the theological errors made possible by the integration of church and state. And so the church perseveres through all of this, right? But I think in the modern world, one of the things that we all too often fall into the trap of thinking, in our more secular, more nation-state diverse world, we fall into this kind of false nostalgia for, if we could only return to empire, right? Oh, if we could only have another Constantine, right? All of our problems would be solved. The fact of the matter is, with the possible exception of the Bolsheviks, the church probably suffered more at an institutional and international level during the reign of the Byzantines and the integration of church and state than at any other time in history, right? Simply because the state could now intervene in a way and insert itself in a way that it actually couldn't do in the age of persecution because they were completely different, right? Once the church comes to rely on state support, it's very hard to stand up to the emperor, right? And so Nicaea for the church was an important milestone, right? It provides us this model for synodal thinking. It's the first time the church produces a statement of faith that is universally believed down to the day. But it also introduced a trajectory in history that would be complex and complicated and not nearly as much the golden age as we often think it to be. Thank you.